questions now also, and then we'll just leave the last lesson for whatever we need. Well, what do I need to do? Okay. So we're talking about access control now. Right? Essa, what do you remember about access control, or what do you know about it in general? We've already a little bit here and there. What can you tell me about it?
So, I guess it would be the permissions one is assigned to do certain things.
Yes?
So was
Sorry, Alex, tell me.
was moderating who has access to certain information, who's able to access in what way to access that information.
Okay. What examples do you know of and can you think about in terms of access control?
File system permissions, so read, write, and execute.
Right? What else?
Users in a workplace and administrators having all having different permissions depending on the situation.
Okay.
Maybe even cross-departmental.
What about how am I going to word this? What would be one of the earliest forms of access control? What do you think? An early, yes, an early form of access control. Let's say it like this.
A key?
Correct. A key, right? Is the simplest and earliest, practically, form of access control. Okay? It should come. Obviously, now the idea has been that we've migrated a bit. Because why am I saying this? Because when it comes to access control, we've got what you just mentioned in terms of file permissions. Okay, so we've got that level of access control, the software access control, but we also have the physical level of access control, right? Who can go where? And I mean, the classical example remains the idea of the key, right? Nowadays, we have replaced the key in certain organizations. I don't know where you work. Do you have some form of access that you need to swipe a card or something, or I don't know, everything is by key, no? And a door is open or it's closed. Right. Now let's start off by looking at this short clip, which is again just to show this concept of access control. Right? Starting off with the traditional version. Okay, so we're looking at the key, but then moving on to even, I mean, this is an advert of a company, so obviously, right?
Locks and keys have been used to secure facilities for decades. What locks and keys can't provide is the ability to control when the keys are used. Additionally, keys can be easily duplicated. This means there may be keys with people that you don't want to have access. And when someone leaves your organization, you potentially are at risk because you can't be sure they've turned in all the keys. To mitigate that risk, you should really rekey your exterior door locks each time someone leaves your organization, an action that could be cost prohibitive. Electronic access control takes all of these shortcomings away by replacing locks with intelligently controlled devices. Now you have the power to control who can go where and when, and it provides an audit trail of everywhere everyone went or even tried to go. So how does it work? Each person is given a card or key fob that acts like their key to your facility. You then tell the system what privileges this person receives. For example, which doors they can use and when they can use them. The system then only allows that person into areas during the days and times you've determined. With a few clicks of a mouse, you can retrieve any activity needed. There are three factors for electronic access control: time zones, access levels, and cards. With time zones, you can create a schedule that determines when something happens. For example, you can set it up so that a particular employee will only be allowed in the office from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. If the employee tries to enter at another time, they will be locked out. With access levels, you can determine which employees have a predefined set of privileges. If you have an area that you want protected, such as a storage room, you can decide which employees are allowed to enter. With cards, you are able to individually control each device. Since every card leaves an audit trail, you can see where and when each employee has gone in the building with a searchable report. By providing precise control of your facility, you can be assured that those leaving your organization can be removed with a few clicks. This reduces your risks, keeping you and your employees safe and secure.
First, it's an advert for Honeywell, but putting aside the advert part, yeah, it does show this idea of physical again. Now here we're talking about physical, but it does fall under the structure of our security concept, okay, where access control is very important, right? Now here, I mean, this small clip was there, this short clip was there to emphasize the advantages of transferring to an electronic system, right? I mean, especially when you've got larger organizations, if you're going to have employees who are constantly leaving, who are constantly changing, it is a problem to stay changing keys physically. So that's a direct advantage of this, of having an electronic system, all right? Apart from that, another important thing is logging, keeping a track of everything, right? There is a lot of flexibility. So you can set, as the clip told us, you're setting time zones, who can enter which office in which time, right? So it does provide a lot of flexibility to the management. In the factory where I used to work, we had, for example, the offices of the engineers of whatever, and they weren't accessible, for example, after a certain time. So after, I don't remember the exact time, after 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the evening, the doors would not be able to be opened unless it was a security guard, right? So this was there on purpose to avoid those personnel working on the night shifts from entering the offices. So you're segregating people like this, right? But this electronic system provides this facility, okay? And this falls under this sort of chapter, this concept of access control, all right? There are many other methods. For example, here I've got another short clip. All right, this one is just showing us, this one, a different form of access control.
Advanced long-range RFID products for automatic identification, vehicle access, rail-bound transportation, and people access, in order to increase efficiency and security. Tagmaster is the world leader in the field of long-range RFID systems thanks to our highly developed technology and global partner network. Using the latest technology has been a key in all of Tagmaster's strategies. With a wide range of products for many different types of purposes, all based on the same license-free 2.45 GHz technology, we ensure a secure and safe long-range reach, up to 14 meters, with an unbeatable reliability. When using our RFID system, the specific code on the ID tag is reflected back to the reader with very high security, using a patented 32-bit error detection method. The technology used guarantees a dense radio lobe without any dead spots, while using an extremely low reader output power. For Tagmaster, every installation is unique. Every access installation makes its own demands on the RFID system. That's why Tagmaster continuously develops new and improved products to meet customer demands. Wider read range is one, and has now been met by the new MarkTag MEM. The MarkTag MEM is a small new ID tag that can be carried around, but also installed on a car dashboard. It creates an extremely wide read lobe, which means that the person using it doesn't have to hold it directly pointed in the direction of the reader to get a long and safe reading distance. Despite its small size, it has a wide range up to 14 meters and a 6-year nominal battery lifetime. The MarkTag MEM is perfect for AVI and people access applications with difficult demands requiring simple solutions. For vehicle identification, there is also the new tamper-proof ID tag MarkTag Max. The MarkTag Max is permanently attached to the windscreen and stops working if somebody tries to remove it. This ensures that the correct vehicle is identified and given access. It has a narrow read range up to 14 meters and a nominal battery lifetime of 6 years. The MarkTag Max is the best solution for safe and secure vehicle identification. These two new products add to the already wide range of great RFID products from Tagmaster. Get online and look at all our products at Tag.
There's no need to get online. So this is another access control system, which, as we've seen, we see it with vehicles. So you've got this concept that you are driving and automatically a gate or something opens, right? So this is not magic, it opens because there is some form of communication. Here in this particular advert, we're seeing the RFID being used as a communication protocol between the car and the sensors, right? But again, it's a question of a means of providing access. So this is another form of physical access control, okay? Because although we're not really going to stay specifying, it's good to note that here we're not talking about the access control, but obviously just physical access to somewhere, right? Which is access control, but one of the sort of subtopics, if you like, of access control. Essa, the question is, one of the important questions that we have is access control on its own a security system? What do you think? Would you consider access control on its own to be secure, to provide security? What do you think?
There needs to be a whole infrastructure behind identifying who's entering and what's their permissions, and so
Okay.
it's not just having the right RFID or key to enter, but there needs to be a whole infrastructure that decides what and where you're going and why are you going there, and
Okay.
yeah.
Gabriel, ايش تحسب Gabriel?
I mean, same thing, but assuming it is also tamper-proof, it does help in the. It does help in it being a bit more secure, but it shouldn't be the only factor, like us.
Yeah, I mean, don't limit yourself to the last thing that we've seen. I mean, I'm talking about access control in general. Right?
Then like with us.
Okay. In fact, we don't consider access control to be secure on its own. Right? It is an important part, yes, of a security system, but access control on its own does not provide us with security. And it is important that we distinguish and we are aware of this also, so that we don't ourselves rely on it, all right, blindly. Okay, and in fact, here my last clip for today is it's just a small clip to emphasize this point, right?
My name is Mike Jagger. I'm with Providence Security, and we're standing up front of the Providence Security showroom in Kerrisdale, 41st and Vine. We're here to talk about access control systems. Almost every single residential building and most commercial buildings in Vancouver have access control systems, and people make the mistake of assuming that their access system is a security system. And just because they've got an access card and they go and swipe it on the reader at the front door and the front door automatically unlocks, that's access control. That's not security. What this is great for is, in comparison to the old system of having a traditional key, if I lost my key, I'd have to report to the building manager and say my key's gone. The building would have to make a decision. Do they want to rekey the whole building? It's quite an expensive process, and there's no way to know who came and went at what time. With an access control system, there's a recording. Every time I swipe my card, the system knows Mike Jagger came in at this time, and if I lose my card, they can just give me a new card, and the old one gets disabled out of the system. So there's some control over the comings and goings, but it's not security. Security comes into play. So if I swipe my card and open up the door, but then I place a rock, and so the door doesn't close completely, or the door is just not working properly, it doesn't close completely. There needs to be a way for the system to recognize that this is a problem and now this building is unsecure. The vast majority of systems that we see only do the access control. It's only allowing people in and out. There's no reporting of any alarms. The way to solve this is you connect your access control system with the security system, and you program to say that when I swipe my card, this door is allowed to be open for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, or if someone's elderly and disabled, we can extend the time frame to 2 minutes. But whatever that time frame is, if that door is not closed and latched, an alarm is created, the signal is sent, and we're on the way to come and investigate why the door is still open. What you need to do is inquire with your building manager or the strata to find out, is your access control system just an access system, or is it an access control tied in with security, which is how you actually increase the security in your building.
All right, so I mean, as we've seen over there, if you're going to open the door, you're accessing, so that's access control. But then if you are leaving the door open, someone else comes by you, right? The system is what
all of the types of credentials used in
happened later. The system is compromised. All right, so that's why we don't consider access control on its own to be a security system. As I said, it is an important part of it, and in fact, in the beginning, in the first lesson, when we discussed the features, it was one of the features of a security system, and it is an important feature of a security system, all right? But we cannot sort of depend on it solely. We need to combine it with other things, right? So that was a bit of an introduction to this topic. So that now we'll start with looking at our work. Okay. So let's have a look. It's true that we are going to concentrate more on the general concept of access control, plus a bit more in terms of the actual computer part of access control. But a lot of things fall in the same bracket. Why did I go back to page? Okay, now, starting off with, this would be the definition for access control, right? Providing limitations, control of access to authorized users through identification and authentication. So we need to somehow identify ourselves, okay, so that we'll be given a certain access. This we've already discussed. Yes. If we look again at this idea of the model, we had seen it in the beginning, and in fact we're going to even mention it next time. All right. So if we've got a military installation with soldiers of different ranks, how would we represent? Do you remember how we could represent this as a model?
I don't think we saw this together, or maybe I'm mistaken.
Okay. We may have mentioned it in the first, just mentioned it briefly, nothing special in the first lesson, don't worry. So, the idea is to have something like this for what is called the military model. And as I said, next week we'll discuss it a little bit more. But this can be represented either like this, like a protection ring, so you've got concentric circles, right? Or a sort of pyramid, where you've got the top and then going down. In this case, if we look at the protection ring, the center part is the one which is the highest level. Right? So that is the one which is the top secret, the most secret possible. Right? The outer circle is the one which is the lowest in terms of security. All right, so the idea is that someone who has access to the middle will have access to all the outer ones, because obviously it's like you are walking through each layer until you get to the middle. Not everyone has access to the middle, but if you have access to the middle, you have access to everything on the outside. So this is the military model. So again, looking at this idea, you would have the general who has more rights than a captain. A captain would have more rights than a sergeant more rights than a private, etc., etc. All right, so this is one way of representing access control, because access control, it's all, in our word, it's all a question of how we are going to represent this access control that we want to offer. If we want to implement a certain level of access control, all right, how are we going to represent this? And this model is one way of doing it, but it is limited to certain situations. Okay, it is limited to situations like, for example, the army. Yes, this particular situation. Alright, so here I've got a small scenario. Okay, can read through the scenario. So we've got a university department. We have an administrator, Mrs. A. The administrator is a sort of faculty officer, so someone who's taking care of the faculty in terms of administration. You've got 3 lecturers, Dr. B, Dr. C, Dr. E, and the head of department. Now, let's suppose that we've got 3 documents which are to our concern. Okay, we've got a document which involves the salary, another one which involves the timetable, and another one which involves the marks. And conceptually, how would you allocate rights? Now, when we say rights, let's sort of focus it down to read and write. So who would have read access and who would have write access to these 3 docs? What do you think? It's an open question in the sense that it's up to you how you would allocate them. What do you think? Any ideas?
Assuming that the documents are all different, that says all of them have different permissions, then
Yes.
you would automatically have all of them in a different way. So, say for example, salary would only be able to be modified by the head of department,
Okay.
but timetable would be mainly by the head of department as well for writing, and then marks would be read by administrator and write by the lecturers and the head of department.
Okay. I mean, it's very open at the time before the time. Okay, so that is your idea, fair enough, right? Issa. However, next we are told who has rights and what, right? So you see over here, what do we have? We have the head of department who has permission to read all of the documents, but write only to salary. All right? The administrator has read and write access to timetable and read access to salary. The lecturers have read access to timetable and write and read access to marks document. So now, I mean, the first question was, what would you do? Here, we are being told what the rights are, right? Yes, how would we represent this as a model? What do you think? I mean, let's start off. Do you think the protection ring system applies in this case?
No, in this case, because there isn't a particular structure which, say, for example, the head of the department has read and write to all of them.
Yes. So that is the first observation, which is obviously a very good observation, because in fact, the protection ring, it really doesn't apply to many situations that we have. Okay, it applies, in fact, it does apply to only certain areas or within specific conditions. Because as you said, it's not a question of, for example, the head of department having everything, right? It is still selective. So how would you, if it were up to you, how would you represent the information? Any ideas on how you would come to actually represent this as a model?
So you create different categories in which you place the files. Like for example, there's a category that these files can be read and written by a certain group of people, and you place those files in those folders, or those files get those access rights, and other files
Okay.
can get kind of files can get read and write, but another group of persons. So you give those files the. So it's not about the people; it's about more about. It's goes both ways. It's a bidirectional
Okay.
system. So that's I think that's how I would do it.
Mhm. Okay. 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 I mean, it's not that easy sometimes. Yes, sir. Now we're going to see this. In fact, there are different ways of representing. All right, there are different ways. Now let's start off by. So I'm going to do a bit of a step back first, looking at some definitions. It's two important terms which we use a lot in access control are the terms objects and subjects. Okay, so it's important that we are able to, one, identify and to distinguish between these two. Right? So an object is what is basically the resource, what we want access to. That is the object. That could be a file, it could be actual physical access to somewhere, right? Or something. Subjects, most of the times, are people requesting access to something. Those are the subjects, and so we tend to refer more to people, but keep in mind all the time that it could be that we are also dealing with processes, for example, or another form of application. Okay? So, subjects and objects. Yes. In terms of, this is just in terms of language, which we find also in literature. We can have different ways on how something is addressed. For example, we can see what a subject is allowed to do, or it may be a bit more passive as what may be done with an object. They still give us the same thing, but just from a different perspective. Right? So here, for example, you are telling what a subject is allowed to do, so certain subjects can read, others can write. First, what may be done with an object? Right? So here you are saying this object, what can be altered? Okay, it's just a question of the language which is being used. Now, when it comes to operations mode, so we see more of this. There are different types of operations. For example, read, write, append, execute, delete, right? These are dependent also on the operating system. So they do vary between A and B, between operating system 1 and 2, right? Looking at these two modes, observe and alter, yes, we've got certain operations which would enable us simply to observe contents, whereas others would be there to also alter contents. So for example, read and execute fall under observe, write, append, delete will fall under alter. Okay? It's not that relevant. I mean, this is just to make sure we settle down a few terms related to the subject more than anything else. Permissions for files, again, this is very dependent on the operating system, but we'll find different permissions for our files, ranging from read and write, which are probably two most popular ones, and to other, like even changing ownership, right? Yes, there are different ways of expressing these permissions. Over there, we're listing three. In fact, we've got the list, the matrices, and the graphs, which are what we're going to see. All right. Now, these will depend on the particular model which is being used. Later on, we're going to look at least mention a few different models, right? But at the end of the day, there isn't a fixed rule which says, Isma, by force, you've got to use this model. In fact, what we find is that while there are established models, a lot of companies would tend to adapt, right? They would take a model or take something from a model and adapt it for their own use. We see this a lot, and in fact, when we're going to do the list of models, when we're going to see some of the models, we are going to note that there is a whole list of models. There is, in fact, quite a comprehensive list of access control models. Right? And what happens is that we start off with one ISO basic model, but then a company will sort of adapt it, an organization adapts it for its own purpose. And some of these organizations publish another model. It happens a lot. Again, there's no rule or law which says you need to use this model. Okay, so this is something which is very, very company dependent. Could be a company doesn't have a model, but let's try and keep that to a minimum as much as possible. So protection ring we've already mentioned, so we'll talk a bit more about it. Now, when we've got something which is not hierarchical or clear cut, we cannot really use the protection ring system. Okay, so we need to opt for some good alternative. And those that we've listed over there are basic concepts which are used in different models. Right, so we've got what is called the access control list, the access control matrix, and the access control graph. Now let's take a little bit of an example, right? So it will help us to understand a bit more. So if we've got our usual two subjects, Alice and Bob are interested in accessing three objects. We've got program 1, database 2, and we are considering those three permissions: read, write, and execute. One way of representing who can do what is through an access control list. Now, a list is nothing more than literally writing down, as you can see over there, what permissions each one has. Right? Once you look at it, I mean, it's quite easy to follow. So you've got the subject, which is Alice. But remember, subjects are the users who is requesting access. The objects are the resources. So in this case, our first subject is Alice, right? And she's got the three resources, the three objects. So program 1, database 2. In brackets, we are writing down, we are including what permissions Alice has. So in the case of program 1, Alice has the permission to execute. In the case of database 1, Alice has the permission to write and read. In the case of database 2, object database 2, Alice has permission to read only, right? So like that, those are the rules, the permissions which are defined for Alice. Okay, so it's quite easy to understand. And likewise, if we look at Bob, right? Bob has write, read, and execute permission for program 1. Bob has read-only permission for database 1. Now, since database 2 is not included, it's not written, that means that Bob does not have any access to database 2. Alright, so Bob has no rights whatsoever on that particular object. Okay? So this is the access control list. Now again, notice if you had to look through different sources of literature, you will find a lot of variations over here. This is one way how we are representing the list. In other situations, you may find some small variations here and there on how this is sort of represented. But at the end of the day, we're always talking about the same concepts, the same thing. Now, next would be to represent this as a matrix. So we have an access control matrix, right? So let's see this again. Now, Alice and Bob, so we've got the subjects on this side versus the objects. This is just the system that we use. There is absolutely nothing wrong if these are interchanged. If you write the objects here and the subjects up here, it's still going to be exactly the same thing, right? Just the way we have adopted one of the conventions that we find in the books, where we use the subjects over there and the objects over there, right? Now, once we look at this, again, it's quite simple to follow what there is written inside here, inside this matrix. Okay, so Alice, in terms of program 1, okay, has permission to execute program 1 because we see in the brackets here that she has permission to execute. In terms of database 1, it's read and write. In terms of database 2, it's read only. Bob, read, write, execute for program 1, read for database 1, and database 2 is empty. Alright? So it's exactly the same information which we saw in the list, but presented in a different way. Now, the advantage, the matrix out of the three systems that we're mentioning is probably the one which is used the most, right? It's used the most also because even when you look at it visually, it's much easier it's quite easy and straightforward to follow, right, visually. So it does provide a more convenient way of representation. And it's also comfortable, especially next to the other one, which we're still going to do, the graph. It's also comfortable. It's a quick way of doing it. What is also good over here compared to the previous one is the fact that when we don't have any permission, so Bob does not have any access to database 2. But this is not left blank, as in the square is left blank, the whole cell. Instead, we're using empty bracket. And that is a bit of a safer approach, right? Because when you leave something out, like I have over here, right? You may have this doubt on whether this is left out because there is no permission or because it may not have been entered or may have been omitted or may have been deleted, right? So the presence of an empty bracket like this sort of emphasizes that it has been considered, yes, but there are no permissions associated with it, right? Okay, with the list and the matrix? You have it, all right?
Yes, yes.
They're pretty straightforward, buddies. Yeah, I think I need a big mug of coffee. At the moment. Well, so there are two important add-ons that we need to consider. The first idea is this one of the groups. Okay, so far we are saying that we've got different subjects and we are allocating rights to these different subjects according to the objects that they want to access, right? Now, this is nice, but it is inefficient when we consider them individual. And the simple case is that, for example, you've got a group of students, all right, I don't know, let's invent you've got 100 students. To stay setting the rights individually of the 100 students is something which is laborious, it's something which is inefficient. Okay, so this is where we get this idea of the groups. So instead of setting the rights for 100 different people, 100 different subjects, we set a group, we form a group, we define the rights of that group, and then it's just a question of linking people to that group. Right? So the idea is, for example, if we've got students, for example, if we look at our school, we've got students, you've got lecturers, and then you've got the academic stuff. Right? So you've got three different groups. So each of these groups has a different set of rights. Students can access certain things, lecturers can access other things, and the staff, the academic staff the administration staff can access other things, right? So here, and in any organization, this idea of a group is there to be more efficient from an administration, from the IT administration point of view also, right? Because as we said, it's very inconvenient to stay assigning rights. Imagine you've got to assign not one or two rights, but quite a list of rights to quite a number of people. This becomes very laborious, right? So whenever possible, we always use the idea of groups. Okay? Now we use also the idea of groups, even when we've got only one person in a group, right? Because now it comes a question of management. When, for example, I don't know, you have a group for administrator, IT administrator, right? Now, you only have one IT administrator, so why should you stay setting the group? But the thing is that even if this, first of all, you don't know if in the future you may have another IT administrator. So that's one thing. But even if the person is replaced, or I mean, a person might resign, leave, and another person might come in. I mean, things that happen. No, instead of reassigning all the rights to this person, it's always a question of linking a person with a group or unlinking him from people. But the rights would have all been set for anyone who has that role of IT administrator, right? So it's a question of good practice in terms of IT management, right? This idea of the groups. Now, certain operating systems, because in fact at the end we're going to stay mentioning and talking about Unix, certain operating systems impose this idea of groups, right? So sometimes you don't have a choice; you have to work with the group concept, right? So, for example, if we take a case where we've got in this matrix, we just have 5 subjects, 4 objects, right? And we notice how these group of subjects and these group of subjects have the same permissions, have the same access to objects. Okay? So in this case, it makes a lot of sense to put all these in one group and all these in another group. Right? And that will bring us to something like this, where we've simplified the matrix to be representative of two groups, right? Now this is how the graph looks. This is our access control graph, right? On the top we've got the subjects, right? In the middle we've got the groups, and then at the bottom you've got the objects. Again, this is just a convention we have adopted, right, from one of the various literature books that we find, right? You can find variations. It's just a visual representation. The matrix is used much more frequent than this, but it is another way of representing it, right? Of representing access control. So if we look at this, again, it's quite pretty straightforward to understand. You've got subjects 1, 2, and 3. They are linked with group 1. So group 1, anything that has to do with group 1 is going to be inherited by these 3 subjects. In this case, group 1 is linked with objects 1, 2, and 3. So that means that subject 1 has access to these 3, subject 2 has access to these 3, and subject 3 has access to these 3 also, right? Any subject linked to that group will have access to all the objects of that group, basically. That's what we're saying, right? And the same applies for the other part, okay? Now, the other feature that we need to know about and use, if necessary, is the idea of negative permissions, okay? Now, let's suppose that we have a group for students, right? And I don't know, students normally access a range of databases. I don't know what, right? They would have access to a range of databases, but for whatever reason, there is one student, and say we don't want this student to access a database of English books. All right, I don't know, I'm just inventing. So whilst all the students can access this, we want this particular one student, we don't want him or her to access this particular database. It wouldn't be efficient, it wouldn't be good if we create another group just for someone like this, okay? Because if you start picking on the exceptions and you create a lot of groups for these exceptions, you're just going to inflate everything with a lot of groups. And that is not very nice. It is not an efficient way of managing the system. So a feature which has been introduced is this idea of the negative permissions. So you would have the students, for example, this particular student would have access to everything a student normally has, but they will put in the exceptions. So we say, accept this particular object, accept this resource, right? So like this, we don't stay creating new groups. We just introduce exceptions. And these exceptions are negative permissions, okay? And in a graph, we represent these negative permissions with sort of an X or a cross on the connection, right? So if we look at this, how it is over here, right? You've got subject 1 is linked to group 1. So subject 1 has access to everything of group 1 except the one which is marked with an X. So in reality, subject 1 only has access to object 2 and object 3 because it doesn't have access to object 1, right? So it's fairly simple, maybe. Any questions? Or all right, easy peasy. Easy peasy. Okay. Kevin, all right?
Yeah, it's good straightforward.
It is. All right, it is straightforward. Right. Just for the fun of it, I want you to do this. Well, this is just like for fun, for fun. what I want from you is to write an access control matrix and an access control list for this. So we reverse the process that we've seen in the previous example. All right? You need something to write on, no problem.
Or just an Excel spreadsheet.
Sorry?
Or just an Excel spreadsheet
Yeah,
for the matrix.
you can, yes.
Yes.
Mela. So, I don't know if you want to take a screenshot and I scroll backwards. It's up to you, really. Try and come up with a matrix and some form of a list. Alright? As a list, we can have different ways of doing it, of course, so anything will go really. And ultimately, although in an exam question you should always sort of explain the idea of groups, etc., etc., but ultimately, when we're talking about a matrix, what we are mainly interested is in linking the subjects with the objects. Okay, subjects with objects. Yeah, I'll give you a few minutes to try it out.
And we have to assume that in both the matrix and the list, the groups don't exist, which is just the subjects and the objects, right?
And ultimately, you have to link the subjects with the objects. Now, you should, as part of your working, explain what the groups are doing. Right? However, as a main exercise, yes, we are linking subjects with objects.
Okay.
Right?
Object trace 1, 2, 3, 4. Subject trace 2, 3, 5. Object 5. 2, 4, 5. 6. 3, 4. Object 4. Subject 2. Project 4, 4, 5, 6.
You want me to go scroll back a bit? Let me know.
Good.
Okay. Quite easy to follow. Not particularly difficult. Granted, we can create a complicated web as much as we want by having a huge number of subjects, a huge number of objects, etc. I mean, in idea, it remains the same.
You mentioned that Unix and Linux, Unix before, that works with groups. Are Unix and Linux are different, or
They are.
okay?
They are. So we'll talk a little bit about them at the end. You've used them a bit.
Yeah, it's very useful. Linux is very nice. I used it in the past. It's quite
Linux or Unix you've used?
no Linux. Linux. I mean,
Linux. No,
some distribution like Mandriva or Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. Yes.
Mandriva was very
So
nice.
we'll talk a little bit.
Okay.
It is. It is. They're a very different concept from Windows.
Yeah.
And now we'll talk a bit about them at the end. Now, Gavin, it's okay with this?
No?
Works in progress?
No, I'm done.
You're done? All right. Mela. Well, what happened to my presentation? Oh, here it is. Okay. So, I mean, as I said, it's a question of following. I mean, in general, we don't have a lot of mistakes here, but you just have to sometimes you would have a link which is missed. So just be careful of these little things, right? So if I were to look at a way of representing this, we may have some variations, okay? But when we look at it like this, we see that we've got the subjects, the objects. So subject 1 is linked to object 1 and 2. Subject 2 has to be linked to objects 1, 2, 3, and 4. Subject 3, because it has also a negative permission, is linked to 1, 3, and 4. Alright? Subject 4 is linked to 2, 3, 4, 5. Subject 5 is linked to 3, 4, 5. And subject 6 is linked to 3 and 4. Alright? So ultimately, this would be the matrix. Now, as I said, it would make sense to write first the groups, even if it's just a bit of extra work, I know, and it's quite simple, but it does. I mean, for completeness, so keeping in mind this sort of an exam, for completeness, we tend to include also the groups, right? The other side is the list, because in this case, we weren't given the permissions, weren't told, because now we have got read and we've got write access. No, we're just told the subject has an access to this object, and that's why I have check marks over here, right? If we're told we've got permissions, read, write, they would have to be fitted inside here, like we've seen in the previous examples with the read, with the curly brackets, doing read and write and whatever, alright? And this is just the list, which is telling us which objects can be accessed by which subject. Okay, so again, this can be, you could have written this a bit slightly different. It wouldn't. it wouldn't really be wrong, right? Because we can find, in fact, a lot of variations, right? So if we look at a typical example, in this case, even a typical question of the exam, right? We can look at something like this. So we will be given a scenario. Now sometimes the scenarios are nice and small. Sometimes they may be a little bit longer in terms of what you have to read and fish out from, right? From the scenario, we will be asked to obtain the subjects, the objects, and in this case, for example, even the operations, right? And then explain. For example, here we're asked how to explain how the group could be used to simplify the access control matrix and then represent in a matrix, right? Because in terms of questions, we can be asked to represent as a list, as a matrix, or as a graph. And one of the three, or the three of them, for all we know, can be put forward as a question, right? Well, try this out now, okay? If I need to get my pen because this one I don't have the answer for. So it's a very typical question, this one that we would find in our work, in our exams.
Documents concerning the accounts are so the account has permission to read the documents. The account has permission to
Let
read
me give you some time first to try it out.
the documents. Trader has already rather timetable timetable the committee has already timetable so access has already access to timetables access to timetables Machine collaboration story. Machine collaboration. Objects. Subjects. Objects. Operation. Equities or groups. Transformations. Right. H. Integrator good. Good. So in this occasion, read
Sorry?
in this occasion, for example, reading a document, for the same document, reading it and writing it will be two different objects. Can be considered like two different objects.
They are two different operations, not objects.
Sorry, operations.
Yes, we have to consider them as being two different operations.
Okay.
So we have to segregate between them. We have to separate. Gavin, all right?
Yes, I'm done.
Done?
Yeah.
So as I was saying, this is a typical approach that we find in our questions. Okay? So we're given a scenario that we need to sort of obviously read first. And then depending on the scenario, we'll have a number of questions. Sometimes the scenario is a little bit long. So if that is the case, you have to be a bit patient. Right? Well, let me start off by looking at the subjects first. Okay, so subjects, we're talking about people, mainly. All right, so what would be the subjects in this case? What do you think?
This is A, B, C, and E, and Professor H.
Yes. Okay, so first, those would be my subjects. Okay? Yes. We're looking now at objects. Okay, now if we look at objects, what objects do we have? What would the objects in this case?
Sorry. So are the three files timetable?
Got it. That's it.
Timetable,
So we've
salary,
got
marks.
salary, timetable, and right. So those would be our three subjects. And then ultimately we've also got the we've got the operations. Okay, and operations in this case we're talking about the read and the write access. Okay, so those would be the two operations that we are mentioning over here. Okay, so that is the first part. Now, even if you're not asked for it directly through a question, it is always the first thing that we start off with, identifying the subjects, the objects, and the permissions or operations. Okay, so next here we are then asked how could we use the group to simplify the access control matrix. I mean, of course, the obvious answer is that the lecturers will be put under one group because they all will share the same permissions. All right? So that is the most obvious answer. All right? However, we should also mention what we discussed, that even in the other case of the head of department and the administrator, they should be linked to a group each individually, even if they will only be groups of one. Okay, because like this, we are preparing for any needs of the future, be it extra people or be it even swapping of people. All right, so that will also help. And the main answer here had to be the idea of the lecturers. Since you've got three subjects with the same permissions, we put them in one group to make it simpler. Finally, we were asked to represent this in a matrix. All right, so if we represent this in a matrix, now this is not going to be very neat from my end. Okay, but if we look at so those are the subjects. All right, we would have the three objects. So we have salary, timetable, and marks. Right, so these are, it's meant to be a straight line. Right, so these are our three objects, and we see how we're going to allocate the rights for these. Okay, so if we start off, head of department has the permission to read all of the documents and has right access to salary. So you've got over here, so these usually represent with the curly brackets, you've got read and write for salary, right? Wait, head of department was H. Letter. So here I've got read and write, and then read all the other documents. Okay, like that. And then we've got the administrator has read and write access to timetable. So timetable, administrator, read and write access, and read access to salary. So when it comes to marks, she doesn't have any access, so we leave it as a set of empty curly brackets. Right? The lecturers each have read access to timetable, right? And write and read access to the marks. And here, this would be empty. Okay, so these would be all empty. My curly brackets are not very tidy, as you can easily notice from over here. So, read and write. To write them on a paper is difficult enough. To write them on a tablet or on this thing is even harder. Okay, and we get something like this without the groups. Obviously, if I had to write also the groups, which again you should include the groups, the middle part where you've got the lectures, at least that should be represented as a group, right? So this would be a very, very, very typical question that we find in our exams. 90s. Any problems with this or all right? Straightforward. Yeah, it's not a particularly difficult thing. And in fact, it's quite simple. I mean, these matrix, especially the matrix concept, is used a lot in operating systems. In operating systems, I mean, because this is a matrix provides an easy way. You've got an array. It's an easy way to program. It's an easy way to handle. Right? That is why it is one of the most commonly used approaches. The graph is more something, for example, conceptual, right? It's not really something that is in practice used. The list, so and so. Yes, sometimes we use the list as well. That depends on the operating system. So, in the next part, in fact, I wanted to discuss a little bit on this idea of Unix, right? Yeah, well, Alex has heard about it. Gavin, have you heard about Unix? Let's say this.
Yes.
You've used Unix or Linux?
I've used Linux and I've also used Mac, and pretty much Linux is based on Unix, it's just its own branch.
All right. Well, um, so here we're looking at a particular operating system, and there is a reason why we're doing a small sort of side tour to Unix. Okay. Now, just as a very small snapshot in terms of history, we're looking at a very old operating system, considering, okay, because Unix was developed, as you can see, in the 1960s. All right, so as an operating system, it's quite an old operating system. Okay, and those two are the people who are attributed with the development of the Unix system. Okay, and it had a novelty that it was operating this concept of time sharing. That you would have this time share between different operations that we want to run. Most of the operating systems during that time were the batch process of operating systems, which were focused on doing one job, really. Okay, so this was quite a novelty, right? Now, apart from this, um, the way they made it was, in fact, because it had a lot when they were developing the Unix, there was a lot of limited resources because resources, even considering the time it was being created in the 1960s, right? Things were very, very limited. Because of this, it was structured in a way of being very efficient. Unix. Okay, and the reason why we're going through this sort of little detour to do a case study on Unix is because it has a lot of important concepts, okay, in terms of security and in terms of file management in general, which, despite its age, so still apply till today. Not only this, that modern operating systems are based on the concepts that Unix sort of originated on it, right? And it is, in fact, a very, very secure and a very reliable operating system. Up till a few, well, not a few, but let's say up till a few years ago, right? Unix was the standard operating system which was used with servers. Okay, so large computer servers normally used to be based on Unix because Unix was very secure and very, very reliable, right? Now, for example, there, this idea of the efficiency, uh, Unix, even after today, is not really interested in the GUI. It's not really interested in the user interface. Okay, it is used its main focus is to get things done, not to look nice. And if we look at the basic concept of Unix, it is still something which is command line interface. It is not a graphical user interface. It's all right. So it contrasts a lot with something like, for example, Windows, which is very graphics oriented. And not only that, but also Windows runs a lot of processes in the background. In fact, it is what really occupies most of the memory and most of the reasons why our computers slow down. Because Windows has a lot of processes which are constantly going on in the background of what we are doing. Right? Now, apart from this, in terms of file management, there were many concepts that sort of they were very new for the time, but we find them in operating systems nowadays, which have adapted from the Unix concept, like the ones that I've written over there. Plus, there are many more. Okay, even something simple like having the inclusion of different languages. To a certain point, there were the original operating systems like Windows, and even I think it maybe also the Mac. I'm not sure about the Mac now. They were only in English. They only provided interface in English. Okay, so which automatically limited the number of people that could use it. Right? Yes, apart from that, we also have security considerations because yes, Unix was from day one very, very security conscious, extreme security conscious, right? And I will mention a few of these things. We see that there is a whole legacy of Unix. Okay, so in fact, what you mentioned, Delix, Linux per se is not the same as Unix. It is a descendant of Unix. Okay, so it is an offspring of it, right? It has concepts which are similar and architecture which are similar, but strictly speaking, it's slightly different in terms of even syntax and these things, right? But even Unix itself, it fragmented into different areas. Okay, it didn't remain the original Unix. It split up into a few other areas, right? So, but there's a whole legacy of Unix. Okay, and I mean, Mac, I think Gavin, you mentioned it, Mac itself. So Apple is based on a Unix system, so you've got a basic Unix platform, and then it's based on top of it. All right, so again, it's another fragmentation of this thing. Right, and I mean, well, it's not my aim to stay going through the historical, but there are some interesting historical facts if you would like to stay reading about this operating system. And despite its age, it is something which is still considered to be tops, right? This is just a very brief comparison between the two, right? Between Unix and Linux. To a certain point nowadays, Linux is something which is more commercially available, especially for the end user. Okay, Unix has not disappeared, but it decreased and it's found in very specific areas as we see computers which are usually a bit more powerful. You know, certain powerful computers, you tend to stick to Unix nowadays, right? But nevertheless, we still have a lot of nice work with Linux. Okay, Linux in itself is a bit more user friendly than Unix. In fact, it has a GUI, right? So I on one of my laptops, I've got Linux, I've got Ubuntu installed. So from time to time, I like to use it. There's a big difference, but in terms of resources between Linux, for example, and Windows. Windows is extremely resource hungry. Okay, your computer slows down considerably, right? As opposed to Linux, which is much more efficient, right? It has always been this concept of something which is Unix based to try and be as efficient as possible in terms even of the hardware. Plus, as we were saying also, because obviously at the end of the day we're talking about security in terms also of security, right? Unix sort of, it put in certain concepts, certain features, which, as I said, in the majority of cases, certain situations they've been adopted only recently by other operating systems, right? But it has been always very, very conscious about practicality, about efficiency, and about security. So now we're going back in a time where the internet was not even created, and yet they were still very security conscious. Okay. One of the important features is this idea of a super user, for example. So Unix is based on a super user where you would have, as the name implies, you've got this login which has all the powers associated with that system, okay, the super user. Obviously, needless to say, it is something which is high risk, so it is very dangerous if it falls in the wrong hands, okay? And in fact, because of the powers, usually a super user account is not accessible from everywhere. It will only be accessible, for example, from a terminal close to the server. It's a physical terminal. You have to literally go physically in that terminal on that computer to be able to access this root account. You cannot access it online or remotely, right? So it implements a sort of physical security to it. Okay, it is part of the features. Again, and these are just part of the features that we see. It's just one of them, right? Now, again, authentication. Nowadays, we think this is weird. It's obvious people you have username and password, but keeping in mind the historical aspect, it wasn't obvious. No. All right. So, from very early days, right, Unix implemented this idea of having a username and password, which were mandatory for someone to access the system, right? Unlike older versions, for example, of the Windows, which didn't really use the system, or if they had, it was a bit superfluous. Okay. Also, encrypting of passwords. Now, what the actual algorithm is for us at this point in time is irrelevant. However, from its early days, it already had this idea of encryption. And a nice sort of point to note is the fact that whenever we've got an algorithm, as you can see over there, it's not just a question of running the algorithm once and you have an encrypted password. In fact, as you can see over there, in this particular case, it was run 25 times. So you're having a password. It is encrypted. The encrypted version is encrypted again. This encrypted version is encrypted again, and encrypted then again, and again, and again, and again. So the fact that you are doing so many iterations means that something is becoming even harder to try and crack, because every time you're passing it through the encryption system, you are making it more jumbled up, okay, more hard to crack. The AES is just one of the many algorithm systems which exist, right? The traditional storage of the password file was this etc stroke password file, right? So that was where it was found. However, it isn't at all straightforward. All right. Unix likes to use this idea of password shadowing, not only with the passwords, but even with other things. Without going into any particular detail, because it is not my aim to go into detail, a nice feature of the Unix system is that instead of providing a direct link to something, it provides a sort of mesh, a jumbled up really a spaghetti junction to access something. So unless you really know what you're doing, it's very easy not to find what you want to find, what you're looking for. All right. In fact, so we're going to mention another thing, an inode. So it's got a whole nice system like this. This is just another feature where machines are able to share passwords between them. Now this would be a typical format of the password file. This was my old file at university because there we had Unix-based systems. All right, so I don't remember what the password was, so don't even try to understand what there was over there. Okay, so I have no idea what my password was in those times. But you can see just different structures, even the fact that the password was never kept in plain text. So if we go back to Windows systems, right? Even Windows old, I mean the initial Windows systems, even like Windows 95, okay, they had passwords which were written in plain text. But then we go to something like this, which is much older, right? Which immediately was encrypting. So like this, we understand and appreciate the philosophy of the Unix system, that it was very oriented towards security.
What was the reason behind, since there was no internet at the time, orienting so much towards security? Because it
No,
was
they just wanted to keep their stuff as secret as possible. They wanted to do something which, it's true there wasn't the internet, but then at that time,
maybe
because here we're
businesses,
talking, sorry,
maybe it was very much used in businesses. So I guess
yes, and keep in mind that we're talking about an era after the Second World War, so you have this boom of companies trying to compete and come out, against each other. So there was this idea to protect it from their competitors more than anything else.
yeah, maybe even the Cold War at the time. So
It could be, or it could just be even a question of espionage between one company and another. So you are avoiding the risk of having people snooping to see what they are doing as opposed to their competitors. So it could be all. I don't know exactly, but it could all have contributed to all this concept. Plus, the idea of networking was sort of slowly gaining pace. The internet was not there as we know it, but it was gaining pace also. Now, apart from that, we can see these are measures which were always implemented within the frame of mind of the Unix system. Nowadays, we think, oh, yeah, these are rather obvious. They're all obvious things. But as I said, in other operating systems that we find, they weren't implemented, or at least they weren't implemented in a strong way. So the fact that you had an operating system which from such an early day implemented these is really something, right? So here, what do we say? So it had issues of passwords, prompting for old passwords. New passwords must be entered twice correctly. Actual characters are never actually displayed on the screen. In fact, the Linux system, um, yes, the Linux systems that we have today still do not show you what you are typing. When you type a password, now I don't know if you have something different, but at least the one I have is like this also. When you type a password, there's no option of seeing what you typed as a password, because in general they just don't like it. It is a security flaw to be able to show your password while you are typing it. And Linux, I mean, on my Ubuntu, for example, it never allows you to do it. It's still, everything is dotted, dot. All right, so I mean, it's the old system, and they've kept it like this, right? So that's another feature. Password sorting, it had the idea of password sorting. We had discussed password sorting with passwords, all right, adding something to make it unique. rejecting weak passwords, expiry dates and preventing the usage of passwords, and also restricting root logins, as I mentioned before, to specific terminals. Okay, so these are all nice features which were implemented to ensure a level of security. Now, when we're sort of moving a little bit closer to home and talking specifically now about access control, right? In Unix, we find the idea, which is very, very dominant, about subjects and objects. So users are all classified as being subjects. However, it doesn't stop there. For Unix, it is imperative that everyone belongs to a group. Okay, so you don't have an individuality doesn't exist. Everyone has to fit into a group. You can have more than one group, but you must at least, a minimum, have one group. Okay, because it works everything with groups. Right, so you would have the principal group, what is called the principal group, and then you can have different groups depending on what the situation is. Because like this, it considers it, and in fact it is a good concept, that it is easier to manage. This is the idea behind it, right? It is much easier to manage. Now also, we have the idea of objects, right? And every resource in Unix is considered to be a file. That is an object. A file is an object, and everything is a file. Even on Linux, so if you're using Ubuntu, and if you had to go through for example, you put in a flash drive, a USB drive, if in your hard disk, everything is really considered as a file, not, for example, like Windows as a drive. You've got different settings, different permissions. No, everything is in the same box. Okay, and these are all considered to be objects. So even drives, files, whatever resource you have for the Unix system, these all fall under objects. Okay, so then users are restricted to, according to the permissions which are set, all right, will have restrictions on what they can access. In terms of permission, it allows read, write, or execute. Those are the three main permissions. Okay, and it works with sets. In fact, we've got three different sets of access rights. All right, one set is for the owner of the file who created the file, then for the group with whom that file is being associated, and for the rest of the world, what we call the rest of the world, which would be the other users. So users which are not the owner and do not fit within the group, right? So Unix distinguishes between these three classifications: owner, group, the other users, right? And rights are allocated to these three separately. As such, when a file is created, a data section is created that contains a lot of information about files. This is just a side note. If you have time to read about it, it is very interesting. And to a certain point, there are also some questions that are unanswered also, because when you start reading about these things, not everything seems to be explained, right? It's either some things they kept them under wraps, right? Or else there's in fact a bit of disagreements about exactly what happens and why and how, etc. But basically here you've got files are associated with what are called these inodes, right? And you've got an inode number. The inodes themselves don't contain the actual names but metadata. And you have what I said before, you've got a whole spaghetti junctions, a spaghetti function of these different pointers and structures pointing from one end to the other all over the hard disk, right? The idea is that it isn't easy to find something. Okay, you need to be well mapped to be able to find what you want, right? And here the inode would have different properties, right? Relating to information about the particular file. Okay, so if you have time, it's interesting to read a little bit about these inodes, about Unix in general. Okay, it is an interesting thing. Getting back to the writes, so we would have these mode bits, they're called, okay? And you would have a set of bits which are used for the access rights. We are mainly interested in these 9 bits, right? Because these are for exterior things, right? But these 9 bits are what are usually more of interest to us. And if I have to look at a directory structure, it would be something like this, typical directory, right? You would have the 9 bits over here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The first one is indicated what that particular resource is, because remember, everything is treated the same in Unix. So for example, D refers to a directory. So here we are referring to a directory, okay? And L would be referring to a file or something. I don't know what this one is, all right? And the latex thing. So Unix, this is how it works. Everything has its own set of permissions, how L is linked to dash is fine, right? Um, and this is why I told you even drives are associated with the same whole concept, right? So everything falls in this sort of structure. And if we look, so because we're so ready, just a final look at 2 small examples. First, we've got this. Now, as you can see here, we've got read write dash, read dash dash, read dash dash, right? So looking at those bits, the first 3 bits on the left are the permissions for the owner, the owner of that resource, the owner of that file, right? So in this case, the owner can read and write, but cannot execute. Now, it could be that it isn't an executable file, right? So it could be that it's just a file which, either like a Word, like a document which is either read or write, to be fair, right? We can have group members, in this case, who can only read this particular resource, and even the rest of the world. They can only read this particular resource, right? Like this. But then if we look at a slightly different example, in this case now, the owner can do everything, read, write, and execute, right? Group members can only read, but the other users do not have any access like this. Okay, they are segregated. So the Unix provides this level of access control that you are able to play around with these bits to decide on who gets access to what, right? Here, this is a case in point, in fact, where we can have an owner of a resource who can write to something but not read it, because if the owner would have the read disabled, once the owner would write a document and closes, then he won't be able to read it. It's a bit strange, but the writes, when you consider the bits individually, they give you this feature, they give you this possibility. Anyway, this is just sort of nothing special, just a flowchart to indicate, is the user the owner, check the file permissions, is the user part of the group, right? Or else access right to the other users. Right? Finally, if you do have time to play around, the command is this change mode, chmod, alright, to play around with the with these access rights for the particular object you have. Okay. So that was the conclusion in a way. And as I said, it's just a small side note to appreciate a bit this Unix system. I mean, Unix, up till a few years ago, it was still the main operating system for servers because they needed something which was reliable, efficient, okay, and secure. It was unheard of, really unheard of, to have a Unix system which provided trouble. Okay, it's not like Windows crashes whenever it feels like crashing. So, I mean, it just didn't happen. Right? Any questions, comments, anything?
No, not really.
Not really. More or less straightforward. It was straightforward. So, like this, we've looked at access control, right? Especially the idea of the access control lists, matrices, graphs, okay, the concept of access control, and also a bit of side note on Unix. So the last thing that we have to do, which will be our last lesson, will be at looking at some models, right? An overview of some models, security models. All right.
So in today's day, apart from Unix, what else is used on servers? I know there's the Windows Server nowadays.
Yes.
And
To be fair, Windows have improved a lot. So let's not always criticize Windows. All right. However, Windows, the way they work is that in fact they are very inefficient with their resources. As I said, I mean, even once your computer is what 2-3 years old, you start already feeling it's slowing down because it's the way it works. Okay. Yes, there is Windows Server. It's true. However, the most popular operating system for servers is Linux. That is the most popular system, and Android is built in fact with Linux. Mac OS is built on Linux also. So it is infiltrated quite a lot, the Linux system. And even cloud services, I'm trying to remember an example, but cloud services, they tend to prefer the Linux to work with. It is the main one which is being used.
Even consoles are also based on Unix.
Yes.
the other time you told us about where the file with the Windows password is stored. I think it's a config folder. Config? No.
Yes.
I actually tried to access it, but I double click on it and it doesn't let me open it. I
You have to.
I mean,
Are you using Are you using an administrator account?
yeah, I mean, I'm using the only account that I have on the Windows. I double clicked on the folder. It doesn't open. Doesn't tell me anything. It just doesn't open. Like
It could be that. I
I don't
have
know.
to say about this, but it could be. First of all, it could be that there is because Windows has a default administration account. Offhand, I don't remember the credentials to access it, but it does have a default admin account.
Okay. I know.
I will have to look into it.
No, I think
Honestly, it's been a while.
I think
Sorry?
now it opened. Is this System32 config? Was it? Yeah. I don't know. Now it managed to open it. I don't know what's happened the other time. It was really strange.
Be careful not to not to edit anything that you shouldn't edit.
I just delete a couple of files.
We'll see what happens with that. Because
Well, I cannot. I still need to finish all my courseworks before doing that.
good luck with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I will see you next. I will see you next time then. All right.
See you in 2 weeks.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so
Bye
much.
ciao.
Have a good night.
And have a good night. Bye, Bella.
Bye bye.
Ciao, ciao.